think yeah, our group is growing, so I think we can go ahead and get started. So again, I think many of you here know Dr. Jenny Soon, but she is a clinical assistant professor here at UW, and she will tell us about providing anticipatory guidance for treatment options for food allergy.
All right, Anya, thank you so much for that lovely introduction and good morning, everybody. Like Anya stated, my name is Jenny. I'm a clinical assistant professor here at University of Washington. I am part of the general allergy clinic as well as the pediatric allergy clinic. So we do see quite a bit of food allergy in my clinical practice. So with that, I'm very happy to present today about essentially guidance and exploring current treatment options available for food allergy. And I'd love to go over a little bit about what we do here at University of Washington as well. So my learning objectives for today, after this lecture, I hope that participants will be able to recognize the available FDA-approved food allergy treatment options, and then also understand the risk versus benefits of these different options available based on supported studies. I do think that this will be helpful as clinicians to help our patient and patient families provide good anticipatory guidance and good education on choosing the right food allergy treatments for them. And right now, certainly a very exciting time to be in the field of food allergy with a bunch of new food allergy treatments available over the past few years. In addition to this, I do want to spend a little bit of time at the end talking about developing food allergy treatments that are currently under investigation. We do offer a few of these at the University of Washington, so I'll go over those as well. But I think it's always something helpful to think about and potentially incorporate into our own clinical practices as well. So I'd like to start my presentation with a little bit of the basics, starting with a definition of food allergy. I do like this definition. I think it's a very practical one. Essentially, food allergy defined as inappropriate, reproducible, immune-based response to food proteins that is mediated by IgE, usually occurring within 30 minutes to 2 hours of the target food ingestion, and can typically be characterized by symptoms such as cutaneous symptoms, which are one of the most common, respiratory, GI, and our cardiovascular symptoms when things are more severe. So I think a few things to keep in mind as someone is coming in with an adverse food reaction, determining whether or not this is an IgE-mediated food allergy. Do these characteristics hit? Is this something reproducible? Does this something happen in the correct time frame? And when thinking about the pathophysiology, is this a IgE-mediated reaction to the food protein itself? And I think as clinicians, that is something helpful to keep in mind throughout this process, because patients can come in with essentially a plethora of different adverse food reactions. And it's our job as clinicians to figure out whether or not this is an IgE-mediated food allergy. But I think this field is certainly something that is evolving, and it's becoming more and more confusing for patients, and something that's more and more in our domain to be able to tease out the logistics of whether this is a food allergy, whether this could be something like lactose intolerance, what I hear about pretty frequently in my clinic as well, or potentially other idiopathic undefined adverse food reactions. And this is important because being able to differentiate this largely due to patient history helps us provide the correct anticipatory guidance and recommendations for our patients in terms of what is appropriate in terms of diagnostic testing, and then also what is the right treatment options for them. Now, in terms of the stats, if we do think about IgE-mediated food allergy, I think it's helpful for some patients to understand the prevalence. So most updated stats I was able to find, 33 million Americans have food allergies. This is about 1 in 10 adults and 1 in 13 children. I think this figure summarizes things very well. Roughly over half of food allergy patients have experienced what is considered a severe reaction. Oh, sorry, right, roughly under half. And about 40 to 48% of food allergy patients have had multiple food allergies, and the incidence of food allergy is certainly on the rise, especially in developed countries. So certainly something that is very, very relevant to today, to people's everyday lives as well. Now, when we think about food allergies, we commonly think about the top 9 target foods that are responsible for about 90% of food allergies. Here we see a nice figure that summarizes all 9 of them: milk, eggs, and peanuts. In the top row are also the 3 most common pediatric onset food allergy target foods. Other food top of the top 9 include tree nuts, finfish, shellfish, wheat, soy, and the newest kid on the block, sesame, is part of the top 9. So when someone comes in, for example, thinking about food allergy, thinking about which foods they might want to test for, what foods they might have anxiety about introducing, or if they come in with a essentially idiopathic anaphylactic reaction, but they're concerned about food allergy, I think these targets are the ones that are most high yield to hit. In terms of patient education, these top 9 are also required by law to be clearly labeled on all foods in very clear language, including foods that may contain or are processed in the same facility as. So I think that is something to keep in mind when talking to patients about target food avoidance if they do develop food allergies to one of these. Now, if symptom history does fit and are likely to represent an IgE-mediated food allergy, we can then go into diagnostic testing. 2 options that are available for us are skin prick test, where we're putting small amounts of the food extract right under the skin via a prick, and then measuring a wheal and flare response compared to a saline and histamine negative and positive control, respectively. Otherwise, we could also do blood work to measure the food-specific IgE in the circulation. I think both these have relatively comparable accuracy rates, and unfortunately have also very high false positive rates, reports of up to 50 to 60%. Choosing which one or potentially doing both would be something that I think is a topic that requires shared decision-making, can be based on what the patient is likely to tolerate, which foods are available via skin prick testing in clinic. And then also if analysis of something like, for example, peanut or tree nut components is helpful. If that's the case, then blood work would be the best bet. Also to think about for skin prick testing, patients need to avoid antihistamines for at least 3 days prior, not to cause a false negative signal. So that's also something to keep in mind in terms of workflow. And especially if testing pops negative, or if the symptom history does not necessarily fit an IgE-mediated food allergy, another option that we could offer as clinicians is an oral food challenge, having the patient eat the food in our clinic in graded steps and then observing for about an hour afterwards. This, of course, bypasses these false positive rates. And I kind of like to pause right here because I think this is typically a point of discussion that I have with many patients, especially now with commercially available direct-to-consumer food intolerance panels out there. Sometimes patients come in with the expectation that we can hopefully test for everything just to figure out and to quote unquote see what food allergies or food intolerances someone may have. And I think with these false positive rates, I think that's something to really educate patients on, to discuss why that may not be the most appropriate way to go, especially if symptom history does not support an IgE-mediated food allergy. I think another topic that typically comes up, especially in the pediatric population, is that a child will have relatively uncontrolled eczema, and families are hoping to use dietary modifications to manage the eczema and want essentially broad food panel testing to help determine which way to go in terms of that. However, the risk we run into with that is that even if the eczema is better controlled, this increases risk of anaphylactic reactions in these kids, so may not also be the best option for them as well. So definitely things to practice shared decision-making, but overall counsel and educate patients on. Another thing to keep in mind in terms of diagnosis for us clinicians is the rate of cross-reactivity. If a patient is allergic to one tree nut, for example, is it beneficial to test for other tree nuts due to cross-reactivity rates? I like this figure from Jackie that shows different levels of cross-reactivity risks. And as you can see, the majority of which are relatively on the lower side, but we certainly have ones such as within the category of finfish or within shellfish, cross-reactivity rates can be very high. And I think this is helpful to think about both in terms of providing patient education, in terms of the likelihood of developing a second or third food allergy, And also to think about balancing that with these 50 to 60% false positive rates with our testing to determine whether or not it is appropriate to quote unquote screen based on cross-reactivity. And for those of us who have yet to take boards, I did find this figure that labels different epitopes in the top 9 food allergies and things that they may be cross-reactive to. I thought this was a nice figure and could be definitely be very highly testable board material. So I put this in here as well. So that was some basics in terms of food allergy prevalence, pathophysiology, and diagnosis. Just wanted to pause and see if there were any questions before I started talking about FDA-approved treatments. And I'm looking in the chat and do not see anything there so far, but any questions before I go on? Okay, great. So in terms of treatment, I'll start with the FDA-approved available treatments. And for these, I essentially break them down into 3 categories. And first is what I consider the gold standard of food allergy treatment, as up until 2020, the only one available for food allergy patients, and that is avoidance and education. So overall identification of food allergy triggers with responsible testing and good detailed history taking. And then being able to provide patient education on how to avoid trigger foods. So that involves talking about not only food allergy education in terms of food label reading, as we talked about earlier for the top 9 food allergens, it's required by law to be labeled clearly on all processed food packages, but also to, especially with younger patients, to talk about how to advocate for themselves out in the real world, whether that is in school or in after school activities, being able to speak up while they're at sleepovers, things along that line, and to talk to them about things like not sharing food and also always carrying epinephrine on hand. In addition to avoidance of food allergy triggers, the other thing that is very important to talk to patients about in terms of food allergy management is management of food allergy reactions. And with that, the use of something like a food allergy action plan I have found to be very helpful. This one specifically from the FAIR website is available to print, I believe, in English and in Spanish, I believe. So things to think about: delineating what are mild symptoms, such as itchy mouth or a few hives, versus severe symptoms, such as angioedema, respiratory distress, multiple episodes of vomiting. For mild symptoms, we generally recommend using a weight-appropriate dose of a second-generation antihistamine. That's also what we have in our clinic to treat allergic reactions during oral food challenges, for example. And then, of course, for severe symptoms, weight appropriate dose of an epinephrine, generally available in auto-injector form. I would say still is the most common, although recently we do have, there is an intranasal epinephrine spray available for patients who are 30 kilos and above. And usually for pediatric patients, these food allergy action plans, there are ones that are provided by the school as well, or we could use our clinical versions and give them to the school, and they usually need to be updated on a yearly basis for the new school year. And I think that is helpful to revisit on a yearly basis, especially for pediatric patients, as weight changes and there need to be potentially adjustments to the dosages of their medication. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that as these food allergy treatment options are developing, some patients have come in who may not be a good fit for oral immunotherapy or omalizumab, who feel that, I don't feel like I'm doing enough for my children in terms of food allergies. And I think that's something to keep in mind, that yes, there are multiple options available, but avoidance and continued management of symptoms during accidental exposure may be a very valid treatment option if conditions at home are so that they cannot appropriately administer omalizumab, for example, or have enough transportation to come in for oral immunotherapy. And I think something to think about especially is that food allergy development is a moving target. I think people can grow out of allergies or grow into allergies with time, something I like to talk to my patients about. And I like this study here that summarized multiple studies talking about the natural course of food allergies in children. And we see that with watching and waiting for egg and cow's milk, there are high rates of resolution, roughly about 80%. For wheat has been reported up to about 70%. And then for other foods, less peanut, roughly 30%, tree nuts, anywhere from 8 to 10, and so on and so forth. So I would say overall, watching and waiting, management of food allergy reactions in the case of accidental exposures, and being able to avoid target foods can be a very realistic option and very appropriate option for some families in which other treatment modalities may not be the best fit. And I think that is something to think about and to talk to patients about in the process of managing their food allergies and determining the right treatment options for them. So the next two I'll talk about in chronological order of when they were approved from the FDA. So the first is peanut oral immunotherapy. There is a commercially available peanut oral immunotherapy product that was approved by the FDA. This was initially approved in January of 2020 for patients 4 to 17 years old. And then in July 2024, approval was expanded to patients of 1 to 3 years of age. And here I just have the figure that shows the proposed treatment course for using this product. The red section shows what we call initial dose escalation. So this occurs on the first visit and occurs for about 4 hours. Prior to this visit, I generally like to do a consultation appointment to explain the treatment course, the risk versus benefits, answer any questions, just to obtain essentially to make time to obtain a true informed consent for patient families. And then afterwards, they come in. Essentially, they do 5 escalating doses, very, very small amounts. And at this stage, it's a peanut powder product that's in a capsule that's broken and then usually mixed in a high calorie mix in food, like a pudding, for example. And then afterwards, they take these 5 escalating doses and then are watched for about an hour afterwards. And as you can see in the red section, that depending on the age of the patient, the initial dose escalation process is slightly different. There's a different end dosage for initial dose escalation. But afterwards, as we move into the updosing phase in the blue section, both ages of patients essentially go down by 1 step and then updose essentially roughly every 2 weeks. It can be longer than that, but should not be more frequent than every 2 weeks. And both age groups will end with the maintenance dose of 300 milligrams of peanut protein. At that point, the peanut powder is in a packet, so it's quite a much larger volume than what they had to start with. And again, mostly helpful if it's mixed into a high mix product. And then they end with 300 milligrams as their maintenance dose, which is equivalent to about 1 peanut. And you have studies showing that this is a good amount and a good goal to get to in terms of prevention of anaphylaxis in the case of accidental ingestion. And I think that is something important to talk to patients about, that in terms of what is guaranteed from this process, it's protection against anaphylaxis from accidental ingestion. And because the indications for age groups of 1 to 3 years old is relatively new, I did want to take a little bit of time to talk about the Poseidon trial, which led to this new expanded FDA approval range. So the Poseidon trial is a phase 3 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial that evaluated for the efficacy and safety of peanut oral immunotherapy in North America and Europe for these patients. Sorry, the slide's a little blurry, but I do think it's a nice summary slide of how this trial design was done. So essentially, they randomized about 146 patients, and inclusion criteria included either clinical history, which was symptoms within 2 hours of peanut ingestion and a positive skin prick test or peanut IgE levels, or these were patients who were naive to peanut but had blood work peanut-specific IgE levels above 5. And in both of these groups of patients, they had to have a positive double-blind placebo-controlled food challenge with reactions somewhere between 3 to 300 milligrams of peanut protein exposure. So again, with that inclusion criteria, they were able to enroll about 146 patients who were randomized in a 2-to-1 ratio to the treatment versus controlled group, and then underwent peanut oral immunotherapy up to 300 milligrams. And then after about 12 months of treatment, they were then they did an exit double-blind placebo-controlled food challenge with the steps listed on the right. And their primary endpoint, as indicated by the red bar, was to be able to tolerate at least 600 milligrams of peanut protein in a single dose. To note, exclusion criteria for these patients were patients who had history of anaphylaxis, eosinophilic esophagitis, which typically clinically is generally contraindicated for oral immunotherapy. They could not have moderate or severe asthma, and they could not have poorly controlled asthma of any severity. So could not have poorly controlled mild intermittent asthma, for example. And last but not least, they could not have history of recurrent GI, renal, or cardiovascular disease. So I would say overall in these patients, in terms of anaphylaxis risk, they were on the lower risk end. So what happened? In terms of the primary endpoint, which is shown by the second column on the left, they were able to have 73.5% of their treatment group to tolerate at least 600 milligrams of a single dose during their exit double-blind placebo-controlled food challenge. And this represented about 1,000 milligrams cumulative dose. And this is compared to 6.3% in the placebo group, and that was able to reach statistical significance. They did go, as we saw in the previous slide, they did actually go a little bit further to 1,000 and 2,000 milligrams during their food challenge. And they found that for 1,000 milligrams, about 64.2% of the treatment group was able to tolerate, compared to 4.2% in the placebo group. And that was also able to reach clinical statistical significance. And then the exploratory endpoint of 2,000 milligrams, about 61.2% of the treatment group was able to tolerate during their exit food challenge, compared to 2.1% in the placebo group. So overall, definitely was able to meet their primary endpoint. So adverse effects, also always very important to patient families, especially in patients of this age. Overall, they did a very detailed analysis of adverse events during this study, the majority of which were considered mild to moderate and generally occurred during the updosing phase, most common being gastrointestinal or respiratory symptoms. Looking at the systemic allergic reactions a little bit more detail, I'd say overall there were the same number of mild systemic allergic reactions in both groups, with 6 moderate systemic allergic reactions in the treatment group compared to 2 in the placebo, 2 of which led to were considered treatment-related systemic allergic reactions. So I would say overall, in terms of efficacy, I think this trial does support that oral immunotherapy does allow patients to tolerate essentially increased amount of peanut exposure. And as we can see, and we've seen in previous oral immunotherapy studies, desensitization to 300 milligrams based on oral immunotherapy protocol generally allows patients to tolerate significantly higher amounts of peanut ingestion in the real world. So I think that is a helpful thing to talk to patients about. It certainly offers quite a bit of a safety net in terms of protection against accidental exposure in case patient eats a little bit more peanut than they're supposed to, and also give some safety net if the amount of exposure to peanut products varies in allergenicity compared to the peanut oral immunotherapy product as well. So I think also definitely something to keep in mind, but it's not without adverse effects. So I think those are also things to talk to patients about. So before I move on to Palforzia, I just wanted to double check if there are any questions. Don't see anything in the chat. So then I'll go on to the next treatment option, which is omalizumab. So omalizumab is a monoclonal anti-Ig antibody that has been approved since 2003 for asthma and is also FDA approved for treatment of chronic spontaneous urticaria and nasal polyposis. So generally a subcutaneous injection that is delivered via a pre-filled syringe or pen if this is done, especially if this is done at home. Now, caveat with home dosing is that first 3 doses have to be administered in office with observation. And then afterwards can be administered at home. Otherwise, this can be administered in office as well, which is something that we do offer at the University of Washington. In February 2024, omalizumab was also approved for the reduction of allergic reactions after accidental ingestion to 1 or more food allergy triggers for patients ages 1 year and above. So I think this is really helpful, and especially in patients with multiple food allergies or in food allergy patients who, in terms of age criteria, did not qualify for the commercially available oral immunotherapy peanut product. Dosing is based on weight and pre-treatment total IgE level. And essentially that would be discovered via, we would have to pull blood work prior to starting to determine pre-treatment total IgE level. And in talking a little bit about omalizumab in terms of FDA approval, this was done through, this was supported via data from the Outmatch trial, which is a phase 3 multi-center double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial that assessed the efficacy and safety of omalizumab for patients with multiple food allergies. In terms of study design, they were able to recruit about 177 patients ages 1 to 55 years who are allergic to peanut and at least 2 other foods. And those foods were either cashew, milk, egg, walnut, wheat, and hazelnut. Inclusion criteria is that there was clinical reactions via food challenge to 100 milligrams of peanut protein or less and 300 milligrams of protein of the other foods in question or less. And then after, in terms of exclusion criteria, if they were below threshold allergic response, either according to the results of diagnostic workup or food challenge, or all of the above to 1, 2, or 3 of those foods. Afterwards, participants were randomly assigned to either treatment or a placebo group in a 2-to-1 ratio, and then received omalizumab for a period of 16 to 20 weeks. The dosing range was based on pre-treatment IgE levels and weight, and dosing range was 75 milligrams every 4 weeks to 600 milligrams every 2 weeks. And then afterwards, the food challenges were repeated. Now, what were the results? Primary endpoint was for peanut, and primary endpoint was peanut protein tolerance of peanut protein in single dose of 600 milligrams or more without dose limiting symptoms. And they were able to reach statistical significance with that in the treatment group compared to the placebo group. Now, secondary endpoints, 1,000 milligrams, tolerance of 1,000 milligrams of protein or more of the other foods of which participants had at least 2 other food allergies, and this would need to occur without dose-limiting symptoms as well. They were looking at key secondary endpoints, and they were able to reach statistical significance for cashew, egg, and milk. And they were able to calculate 95% confidence intervals for the other secondary endpoints for walnut, hazelnut, wheat, but did not calculate the p-values for those. And then they did actually also measure quality of life through validated questionnaires for these patients as well. And they did find that overall, during the initial treatment period of 20 weeks, they did not know any specific notable differences in quality of life between the treatment or the placebo-controlled group. However, of the first 60 participants who completed the first stage, they were enrolled in a 24-week open label extension. And with continuation of reporting of quality of life in the open label extension, did find some improvements in quality of life for those participants as well. And then in terms of adverse effects, in the Outmatch trial itself, adverse effects were reported to be similar between the treatment and control groups, with the exception of injection site reactions, which was reported more commonly in the treatment group. And I think when we're talking about something like a subcutaneous injection medication, that is something that families, especially parents, are very mindful of. So I did include the adverse effects listed on the drug company website in this slide as well, because this is something that patients will typically look up and have questions about. Certainly in clinic, we've had questions from patients, even outside of the realm of food allergy, about some of these adverse effects. But most commonly injection site reactions, and usually those are things that we can manage with supportive treatment. There's certainly a risk of anaphylaxis, and this is why the first 3 doses, even with home dosing, must be started in office. Often patients may choose to carry epinephrine in case of anaphylactic reactions at home to the medication. Fever, arthralgia, rash, could be other reported side effects, parasitic infections in high-risk patients, and from observational studies, malignancy and cardiovascular events. I definitely have experience of patients who have asked these questions about malignancy risks particularly. And generally speaking, because these are observational studies, there has not been proven cause and effect with omalizumab. So I think that is something to keep in mind. And I think the other thing to keep in mind, especially with a younger population, an atopic population, is that with omalizumab, this can make subsequent skin prick testing and IgE immunocaps, whether that's for environmental allergies or for food allergies, difficult to interpret. So it's definitely something to keep in mind if patients would hope to pursue more allergy testing in the future. And the question is, how long do we need to stop omalizumab for prior to IgE testing? And the answer to that is roughly about 5 half-lives, so around the 6-month range. So that's definitely something to keep in mind for patients as well. And the other thing to keep in mind that with the outmatch trial, right now we have data out for STEP for the first stage. And right now for both omalizumab and for oral immunotherapy, what we can say is that data supports prevention of anaphylactic reactions in case of accidental ingestion. There's some studies in oral immunotherapy that does show immunomodulatory effects, especially if started young, where patients can achieve sustained unresponsiveness even after discontinuation of oral immunotherapy. Right now, it looks like that is being studied in the outmatch trial in the second, especially in the 3rd stage for omalizumab, but right now is not a guarantee. So what we can say in terms of anticipatory guidance for omalizumab is that as long as the patient continues the medication, there can be protective effects against anaphylaxis. However, more data is to come for the 2nd stage of the outmatch trial. They're looking at omalizumab in conjunction with oral immunotherapy for multiple food allergies. And then the 3rd stage, assessing the introductions of the allergenic foods back into the diet after having a certain amount of omalizumab or oral immunotherapy treatment. Last but not least, I think since this is a new medication, I think having some patient education information is helpful. Other than the company website, the New England Journal of Medicine does have a 2-minute summary video of the outmatch trial and a 1-page summary. I think that's very patient-friendly and helpful in terms of review and patient education if they wanted a little bit more information. Okay, so those were the FDA-approved food allergy treatments. Just wanted to pause to see if there were any questions before moving on to non-FDA approved treatment options. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Great. Sorry, I lost my presenter view for a second. Okay, so in terms of non-FDA approved treatment options, I'll discuss a few, many of which that we do have available here at the University of Washington, starting with egg and milk ladders. So essentially used for low-risk patients who do tolerate baked milk and baked egg products already. And that can be discussed via clinical history or proven via in-office baked milk or bake egg challenge. And essentially, this provides a structured approach for families to progress from baked egg and baked milk products to cooked / raw versions of these products. So this is an example of the Canadian egg ladder. So usually we would start with step one, tolerance of a baked egg product. And usually my guidance for that is tolerance of something that's baked for 350 degrees for at least 20 minutes. And usually I would encourage a age-appropriate serving size at least 2 times a week, more if they can tolerate. And we want to do that for at least 3 months or so before moving up to the next step, which is step two. Do that for about 2 times a week for 3 months, so on and so forth. I think depending on the symptom history, severity of symptoms, and overall the level of risk aversion patients have, some choose before going to step three to come in for a in-office cooked egg challenge prior to proceeding to step three and step four. Some choose to potentially just to go on with it at home, and I think either option works. Other things to keep in mind is availability for oral food challenges in clinic, which has been a challenge in our clinic where wait times can be everywhere up to 6 months. And because of that, if patients are doing well at home, some families just opt to potentially just continue at home rather than coming in for retesting and in-office challenge prior to progressing into step three. Here is the image for baked milk, and same thing, they would start at step one and then roughly have an age-appropriate serving size 2 times a week and then move up at roughly every 3 months. And I think this provides a nice structure for families to progress from baked milk to potentially cooked products, cooked milk products, and then cooked egg products. But I think the jury is out on whether this is something that is actually a quote unquote treatment, or is this more of just a structure to guide patient families as patients just naturally outgrow these food allergies. As we've just discussed earlier on in this presentation, in terms of the natural course of egg and milk allergies in children, there's a very high outgrowth rate. But I think either way, some families really appreciate that structure. Early food introduction and management of food introduction, especially in patients with food allergies, can be challenging. So just kind of having a step-by-step plan is very valuable to some families. And again, these should be limited to overall more low-risk patients and those who have already demonstrated tolerance of the baked products. Other options that are available at the University of Washington is oral immunotherapy using food-grade products. We have this for peanut as well as tree nut and sesame and baked egg, which we do much less of. But essentially with food-grade products, the issue is that this is not FDA approved necessarily. Kind of how I like to tell patients, this is an FDA approved concept, but using non-FDA approved products. And with food grade products, there is some variability in terms of the amount of protein batch to batch. So I think that is also something to keep in mind for families. But this is the protocol that we use for tree nuts specifically. Overall, I think with this study, it showed a relatively larger scale tree nut oral immunotherapy study that showed good safety data for this. So this is why we chose this protocol. And overall, it seems to be very user friendly. What we generally do is essentially lump the first three dose steps into an initial dose escalation day, very similar to the commercially made available peanut oral immunotherapy product. And then afterwards, up dose roughly every 2 weeks. They can do this with tree nut flour or tree nut milk. And I will say tree nut flour has proved to be challenging, especially in these first couple of steps, just because the volume is so low. It's not something that can be typically measured with generally available kitchen tools that families have. I've had one family elect to start with the tree nut flour products, and what they ended up having to do is actually go to a compounding pharmacy with the tree nut flour and compound them into capsules with filler, and then break apart the capsules into a mixture product. So that generally becomes difficult. So usually, especially in these first steps, I tend to go with the tree nut milks, and there are commercially available milk products, tree nut milk products out there that is just the tree nut and water. So that makes that part very easy to do. And then later on, as we're getting into these larger volume steps where that can be measured more reliably with standard kitchen tools like teaspoons, then we can potentially switch to flours, just because for travel, that's a little bit easier, I think. Financially, it's a little bit easier for families because the tree nut milks tend to be pretty expensive and have a very short shelf life. So I think these are all things to keep in mind in choosing the proper food grade products for oral immunotherapy protocol. Other considerations for oral immunotherapy include multi-food oral immunotherapy, and we're doing that to some degree with the tree nut protocol. For example, someone who is allergic to multiple tree nuts, they can actually do them all in conjunction. So that is something to think. That is something that can be helpful for families, especially if the timeline is a little bit tight and there are multiple food allergens to consider. Otherwise, home-based oral immunotherapy is also potentially an option that we have done for select patients who are reliable, but for whether it's because of where they live or because of transportation issues, cannot necessarily commit to coming in so frequently for in-office updosing. And generally with home-based oral immunotherapy, updosing occurs at much, much smaller intervals, and there is frequent follow-up via telemedicine. So that is another way we can use telemedicine to help provide guided care for these patients. I do see some questions in the chat, so I'll pause real quick. Yes, for sublingual, yes, I will get to that in 1 second, Angela. Good timing. Hold on 1 second. So for sublingual immunotherapy, let's see, I'm trying to go back 1 page. There we go. So this, I think for sublingual immunotherapy, we have done this very limited capacity. But I do think overall sublingual immunotherapy, not FDA approved, but certainly under investigation. During our most recent round of maintenance certification through the ABAI, we did have this article available that explored essentially the efficacy of peanut sublingual immunotherapy for children 1 to 11 years old. They essentially took 47 challenge proven peanut allergic patients, and they were given 4 milligrams of peanut sublingual immunotherapy for 48 months, and then afterwards were assigned a period of avoidance for 1 to 17 weeks afterwards, and then underwent a double-blind placebo-controlled food challenge. Afterwards, they assessed not only the results of that, but also various diagnostic measures, including skin prick testing, IgE levels, and those were measured longitudinally as well. They also essentially self-reported in terms of symptoms, and overall, I think results were pretty promising. So in terms of the double-blind placebo-controlled food challenge, they showed that 70% were able to achieve what was deemed clinically significant desensitization, and that was tolerance of at least 800 milligrams of protein at the exit food challenge. And then 36% achieved full desensitization. So went through the entire double-blind placebo-controlled food challenge protocol and were able to tolerate 5,000 milligrams of the peanut protein, all of which did meet statistical significance. And then I think in terms of the commonly used diagnostic measures, in terms of peanut skin prick testing, as shown in the upper left graph, we did show that as soon as 12 months, we did see clinically significant decrease in terms of the skin prick testing compared to initial start. And then with peanut specific IgE shown in the top right, we actually did show increase at 6 months, followed by statistically significant decrease in peanut IgE levels by 24 months and beyond. And this is something that we have seen previously with both oral immunotherapy and other forms of immunotherapy as well. When we're looking at IgG4 levels, something that's more predictive of tolerance, we do show increase in IgG4 levels as early as 6 months after treatment, and same thing with IgG4 to IgE ratios. So I think overall, in terms of, this is a small scale study, but overall does show both clinical improvement in terms of the food challenge results and also improvement in terms of standardly used diagnostic measures. And then looking at adverse effect, overall, I'd say pretty low. Most common reported adverse effect was transient oropharyngeal itching. And this is commonly, we see this in clinic as well, and no dosing symptoms ever required epinephrine. So I think overall, I think this is definitely promising. And I think overall, in terms of adverse effects, seems pretty well tolerated. So definitely something to keep an eye on for the future. How we generally use this in clinic we reserved sublingual immunotherapy cases for those who generally can't tolerate oral immunotherapy well, but is very interested in an immunotherapy approach. So we've used sublingual immunotherapy as a way to bypass the OIT buildup phase in higher risk patients, and that's supported by studies as well. Other treatment options that are under investigation that we currently do not offer in our clinic include the peanut patch. I know that is currently under investigation right now. Epicutaneous immunotherapy to 250 micrograms of protein for the prevention of anaphylaxis as well. And last but not least, other biologics. This study was also featured in our maintenance of certification last round, but this is a nice summary slide of different clinical trials in food allergy that are currently being held to investigate both omalizumab in different capacities, such as with oral immunotherapy, and also other biologics currently being investigated for the management and treatment of food allergy. Okay. All right. So ending things a little bit early, but I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you everyone for your attention. And in the chat already, but I don't see anything new, and I welcome any questions.
Hey Jenny, this is Lily. I'm just curious as to people's success in getting omalizumab covered for adults.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think overall, I will say most of my takers have been adolescent children. So those with multiple food allergies who are potentially going to college. And that's gone pretty well. I think with adults, I personally have not had any takers who've had an IgE level within approved range for dosing. So I personally do not have any experience with that. I'm not sure if anyone else on the call has had much of that experience. See something in the chat.
Just
Yeah, still having
related question, and sorry, Jenny, great talk. Sorry if you answered this already, but how have you seen the uptake of omalizumab to be either locally or nationally, and how challenging is approval on average?
I think overall we have gotten, I think, 3 or 4 pediatric patients approved. Of course, this is, and one actually did have a total IgE level above standard dosing recommendations. So that was surprising. But generally speaking, at least for what I can speak about with the pediatric population, as long as total IgE levels were within approved dosing, we have been successful on multiple cases. I think in terms of what buy-in is for patient families, generally speaking, what I see is that there is some hesitancy to quote unquote use a medication in an injectable medication, especially in younger kids, in favor of potentially seeing if they outgrow the allergy, or in use of something like oral immunotherapy with a food grade product, especially if there's more immunomodulatory effects there. So I think based on right now lack of support for immunomodulatory effects, and this is a quote unquote injectable medication. I think with that, there's less buy-in for the younger populations. But I'd say for teenagers, especially those going to college, especially those with multiple food allergies, that seems to be where omalizumab is mostly favored. And talking to my colleagues at other institutions, that also seems to be the case there. See, DeLauer said has had 3 and 1 required multiple appeals. And I'm assuming that means 3 adult patients, correct, DeLauer?
Yeah, great talk, Jenny. I've had 3 adult patients that have gotten approved. One of them had, pretty severe anaphylaxis requiring hospitalization. So that one was actually the easiest to get through, just given the severity of the reaction. And then I've had a lot of 20-year-olds that are in college that had allergies, as children multiple food allergies diagnosed that have wanted to do Xolair, and one of them required 3 appeals, but then we finally got it. But we have, at least in our UW allergy clinic at Northwest, I think 3 or 4 adult patients that are on Xolair for food allergies.
And I also see a comment in the chat that one of the local major insurance requires peanut allergy as a precondition to approval.
Yeah, I've definitely found that they tried to replicate what they did in Outmatch as a way of, determining insurance coverage, so they don't have to, I think, cover as many therapies. But I think that what I've done, at least for my one patient that got rejected, was continue to appeal and just state this is not the FDA approved label indication, and here's the data to support, and other smaller studies that it can be used for, other adult patients with multiple food allergies.
Hi, Jenny. Great presentation. It's Angela coming into work here. I had some patients who were approved pretty straightforward, exactly like Outmatch, multiple food allergies, positive OFC in the past, and or strict avoidance with occasional accidental anaphylaxis with recent emergency department visits and all that. Whereas, interestingly, I've had some other adult patients where they got it approved because they happen to have, extrinsic asthma at the same time. So that was slightly different reason why the appeal still, allowed them to have that approval on asthma alone. However, interestingly enough, I have some adult patients who are very anxious about food allergy. And so in doing the testing to prove the allergy, it returns normal. And so we not pursue omalizumab. However, we're able to make a point to a patient saying, you may have outgrown your allergy. Your allergy may be caused by, something else as a different adverse food reaction. So even sometimes moving forward with trying to get omalizumab approved sometimes is weirdly helpful in unexpected ways.
Absolutely. No, I think that's great. And Angela, just out of curiosity, did any of these patients pursue in-office food challenges after negative testing?
No, that's the interesting thing. I will offer that. I'll say, the next step is an OFC and we can get a tryptase as soon as we see something happening. And I just don't really hear anything from them since.
Fair enough, fair enough. But yeah, no, I agree. I think that process, especially for highly anxious patients, potentially reevaluating and seeing negative results, I think could be very helpful. That's great. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you everyone for your attention. Please stay safe on the roads out there, and have a great rest of your day.